The image of the Vikings that most people carry is one of warriors, explorers, and fearless sailors who carved their way across seas and into legend. Dragon-headed ships cutting through the mist and iron axes crashing down on unprepared villages. Yet behind this heroic facade lies a much darker and far more human story. One built not on glory, but on the slow grind of survival. A story of hunger gnawing at the belly during long months when the sun barely rose. Of smoke-choked longhouses packed with animals and people whose lungs blackened from the very fires that kept them alive. Of desperate preservation techniques that turned food into something closer to punishment than nourishment. And of social systems built entirely upon the labor of enslaved men and women, whose existence was reduced to fuel for the survival of others. This story is not legend. It is etched into bones excavated from frozen soil, into soot layers found in the ruins of longhouses, into isotopic signatures preserved in skeletons that still reveal what the Vikings ate, and more importantly, what they were forced to eat when times turned grim. To understand the Viking Age, one must strip away the romance and confront the reality. The long winter was the true enemy, and defeating it required violence, exploitation, and endless sacrifice. The Longhouse itself was not a hall of glory. It was a survival machine, built long and low, hunched into the landscape as if crouching against the wind. It might stretch 90 feet in length, but was only 20 feet wide. Its walls were timber, turf, and earth, designed not to impress but to endure. There were no windows. To cut a hole in the wall would be to invite the wind to steal away the only warmth. Inside, a central fire burned constantly, its light dim, its smoke filling the air until it seared the eyes and lungs. Archaeologists who excavated longhouse sites like those at Borg in Norway or Lotter find centuries of soot packed into the soil, evidence of lives lived in haze. Skeletons unearthed nearby show signs of chronic respiratory disease, as if the fire that kept them alive was at the same time slowly killing them. The floor was packed dirt, damp and cold, while raised wooden benches along the sides served as beds, workbenches, and dining spaces all at once. Privacy did not exist. The chieftain and his family slept alongside hired hands and enslaved thralls. And in the depths of winter, the livestock joined them. Sheep, cattle, even oxen brought inside to prevent their death from frost or wolves. Their breath and body heat added to the warmth, but so too did their stench. The air was thick with manure, sweat, wet wool, and smoke, a stew of smells that clung to hair and clothing. This was the true scent of Viking winter, far removed from the polished romance of sagas. Food was the battlefield that determined life or death long before snow fell. The harvests of autumn and the hunts of late summer were not merely seasonal events, but desperate campaigns to stockpile ammunition for the siege of winter. Barley and rye, dried and stored in clay-lined pits, formed the backbone of the diet. But grain alone could not sustain muscle. Protein was survival, and protein meant fish and meat preserved by any means possible. Along the coastal villages, racks stretched for hundreds of feet, hung with gutted cod that dried in the wind until they turned hard and nearly weightless. This was stockfish, the Viking superfood. Dense protein that could last years if kept dry. To eat it required soaking, hammering, boiling, and chewing through fibers as tough as wood. Meat from slaughtered animals was dried into strips and hung in the rafters, where smoke preserved it and imparted a bitter, tarry flavor. But drying was not enough. Salt was essential, and salt was life. Entire settlements were built around salt production, boiling seawater in great clay pots, stripping landscapes of fuel to create a gray, gritty substance that preserved meat in barrels. Salted pork and herring, though harsh to the taste, meant security. A barrel opened in January was proof of survival bought months earlier. In Iceland, where salt was nearly unobtainable, desperation forced new methods. Greenland shark, poisonous when fresh, was buried in sand pits, pressed with stones, left to rot, then hung to dry until its flesh became edible. The result, Hákarl, smelled of ammonia so strongly that even today it challenges anyone who tries it. Yet to Viking families, it was survival disguised as food. Other foods were fermented in whey, pressed into blocks of preserved organs, or even sunk into bogs where cold, oxygen-poor water would pickle fat into what we now know as bog butter. These caches, sometimes weighing over 50 pounds, could be pulled from the mire months or years later, still edible. Nothing was wasted. Every organ, every scrap of fat, every possible calorie was hoarded. And behind all this work stood the Thralls, the enslaved men, women, and children who had no choice. Viking raids are often remembered as lightning strikes against monasteries, searching for silver and relics. But the true treasure brought back across the sea was not glittering chalices. It was people. Slaves taken from Ireland, Britain, and the Slavic lands were bought and sold in markets at Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin. A healthy male thrall cost as much as a horse. A female thrall was more valuable still, both for her labor and her capacity to bear more slaves. These people formed the invisible backbone of Viking survival. They cut the wood, gutted the fish, tended the fields, and split the endless cords of firewood needed to keep the central fire alive. They lived on the worst food. Bones show their diet was dominated by low-quality fish and thin barley gruel. They were the last to eat, and in times of famine, the first to starve. Their lives could be cut short without consequence. Sagas describe their killings with casual indifference, a chieftain striking down a thrall in anger or offering them as sacrifice to the gods. In this way, the Longhouse's warmth, food, and security rested upon a foundation of unfree labor. Survival was not free. It was extracted from human lives. And then there was faith. To the Viking mind, the world was unpredictable, controlled by gods who demanded gifts. Blot, the sacrificial feasts, were their answer. In autumn, as harvests ended, horses, oxen, and boars were killed to thank the gods. Blood was sprinkled on walls and worshippers alike, while meat was boiled and shared. The feast was at once religion and rationing, an act of worship that distributed protein at the very moment it was most needed. Occasionally, humans too were sacrificed. Christian clerics like Adam of Bremen described grim rituals at Uppsala, where men hung in sacred groves alongside animals. His accounts may be exaggerated, but archaeology confirms at least some truth. Bog bodies with cut throats and signs of ritual killing. In times of crisis, poor harvests, relentless winters, such acts were both desperate pleas to the divine and coldly practical ways of rationing scarce resources. When the days shortened into mere hours of light, or none at all north of the Arctic Circle, the Vikings entered the murky time. It was not just darkness but a psychological weight. People huddled around firelight, the circle of warmth the only world that mattered. Men repaired weapons, carved wood, and prepared ropes. Women spun wool, wove yarn, and created sails that would power ships the following spring. A single sail might demand wool from 2,000 sheep and thousands of hours of labor. All of it done in dim, smoky air, shoulders aching, eyes straining. Around the hearth, spindle whirls and loom weights still testify to the ceaseless work of women in the Longhouse. But even with all this preparation, the balance was fragile. Some winters, food ran short. By January or February, when stocks failed, the real desperation began. Animals were slaughtered prematurely, providing fresh meat that could not be preserved, but buying only weeks of survival. Bark was ground into flour, moss scraped from rocks, leather boiled into something chewable. Stomach contents of Iron Age bog bodies show exactly this. Grains mixed with weeds, bark, and chaff, desperate foods with no nutrition. Hunger made people cruel, communities fractured. Sagas tell of neighbors raiding one another, of betrayal, of families turning violent when food became scarce. The strong hoarded, the weak starved. Thralls were cast aside. Sometimes even children were sacrificed in hopes of divine rescue. Winter was a crucible that revealed the rawest form of Viking society, where survival eclipsed morality. All of this, the smoke-filled homes, the endless labor, the salt and smoke, the slavery and blood, the desperate prayers, was connected to the raids for which the Vikings are most remembered. Raiding was not simply conquest or lust for wealth. It was a logistical necessity, a violent form of grocery shopping. Grain, cattle, and above all, new thralls were the treasures brought home. A successful raid meant barrels filled and labor secured. A failed raid meant starvation. The entire Viking world spun on this cycle. Violence abroad, desperate conservation at home. Two halves of the same survival machine. And at its center was the fire, that constant flame, burning day and night for 8 months of winter, consuming mountains of timber, stripping forests bare for miles around, demanding endless toil to keep it alive. The fire was warmth, food, and safety. It was also a beast that devoured labor and forest alike. To keep it fed, thralls cut and hauled wood without end. The fire became the measure of a chieftain's power. The larger the longhouse, the brighter the flame, the more lives consumed to sustain it. This was the heart of Viking survival: salt, smoke, slavery, and fire. To see the Vikings clearly, we must abandon the myths of glory. Their true story is not carved into sagas of heroes, but into the soot-stained timbers of longhouses, into the chemical signatures of bones, into the caches of bog butter pulled from the peat. It is a story of winters survived by any means necessary, of raids driven not by greed alone but by the hunger of families waiting in smoke-filled darkness. The Viking Age was less about conquest and more about enduring the siege of winter. Their longships may have conquered seas, but the Longhouse was their fortress against the cold, a fortress built on exploitation and sacrifice. And when we strip away the legends, what remains is this. The Vikings were not just raiders of the world, they were prisoners of their own winters. And everything they did, their voyages, their violence, their faith, was part of a desperate, relentless struggle to keep the fire burning until spring returned once more.